just experienced such a compassion for the people who hated me, the people who avoided me, who couldn't look at me, who spat at me because I was asking for money. And I had such an understanding of the incredible fear that people have of poverty or of difference that it changed the way that I interact constantly with other people, both up and down on the social scale. So that can't help but make a difference. As I say to my students, you know, it's not about giving somebody a quarter, it's about giving them an eye contact. It's about allowing that person to exist in your world. And that's something you can't figure out in your head. You have to be there and do it, and to really experience it. To me, it's an essential Zen teaching. That's what we learn in koan study, is that we are the Nazi as well as the victim, that we are the corporate people that are responsible for some profiteering on AIDS drugs or something like that, and that we're not separate from either situation. We have a group of meditators, or people with AIDS, who come together and we practice and meditate together. And I listen to their issues, and I speak in the whole AIDS community. I'm the Buddhist representative.
I was young, in the university, maybe 20 years old. I thought maybe I would become a therapist, but I didn't really know what a therapist did. I just knew that it perhaps was something I could do well because it didn't involve working in the traditional way. It involved listening. I took courses in psychology and I took courses in religion. And the graduate student who was running one of the seminars I was taking in a course in psychophysiology was a man named Daniel Goleman, who had just come back from India, where he had been studying or researching various meditation techniques. And I knew from something that he wasn't saying, I knew from the way that he looked or the way that he felt or something that he knew something that I wanted to know. And I asked him, you know, where can I learn what you already know? And he said, oh, some friends of mine are going to be teaching this summer at a place out in Boulder, Colorado called Naropa Institute. And if you want to learn about this, you could go out there. I went there and I met various American Buddhist teachers, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, Ram Dass, and that really began my interest and training in Buddhist practice. And it was only once I had done that for a few years that I realized, oh, there were links between this world and the world of psychotherapy.
Helpless, helpless, helpless.
I have a very clear sense of myself being very much part of my generation of Americans. So being very disillusioned with the Kennedy assassination and very disillusioned with the society, and then being in graduate school and leaving and going to Asia when I was very young. I started reading Kerouac when I was in high school, so I was very familiar with Dharma bums. I went to see Gary Snyder, came and gave a poetry reading in New York. So already there was the identification with anybody outside the culture. And so Buddhism was outside the culture, Asia was outside the culture, Hinduism was outside the culture, drugs were outside the culture. But so I remember being very much part of a counterculture, and I can't really remember going towards Buddhism. I have a very clear idea of going away from.
Throwing shadows on our eyes, leave us helpless.
Once you have a group of people who have been meditating for 15 or 20 years, really experiencing themselves as part of the whole, there's going to be concern about the whole. There's going to be a need to do something, but somehow the institutions were still only doing retreats and sessions and lectures and studies of that kind, and not really getting involved in some kind of an engagement or an awareness of what was going on in terms of suffering in the outer world. And so I think that's why the order started. It started as a way to bring together people who were noticing these things and allow them to work together. And over the past 5 or 6 years, it's been developing as a place for people to come together, kind of a virtual order. It doesn't really exist in any one place, but it's more or less people can communicate by way of the web or by way of meetings to talk about how they're working with their spiritual practice and social engagement.
All life is filled with a sense, or tinged with a sense, of pervasive unsatisfactoriness. That's the Buddha's first truth. And that is very consistent with, for instance, Freud's first truth of psychoanalysis, which is that the best that he could do for anyone was to take them from a state of neurotic suffering to one of common unhappiness. So there's that kind of fundamental link grabbed my attention right away. So then the Buddha goes on in the subsequent truths to talk about the cause of this unsatisfactoriness, which is basically our desire for certainty in a world that's always changing. And then the fact that there is a cure for it, that there is a means to free ourselves from the suffering, the anxiety, the fear, the unsatisfactoriness that permeates our lives, and that the means of freeing ourselves from it is actually a way of transforming the way we experience the world. It's a change that can take place in our psychology, in our consciousness, in our minds, that comes from not pushing away that which we don't like and experience and not holding on to that which we do like. So it's, again, going against the grain of how we naturally operate. Those are the Buddha's Four Noble Truths.
And there was a feeling that if we could create a language where Buddhists from different traditions could talk to each other and have a forum for talking to each other, and we could be a non-sectarian magazine, that at the same time that language would serve for a discourse between Buddhists and non-Buddhists, and that maybe we could create enough interest to actually make the magazine float financially. And that was the idea. Up until that point, we saw each other as quite separate. There was the Vipassana scene, the Zen scene, the Tibetan Buddhist scene. There was always some kind of vague, even among the new Buddhists, the convert Buddhists, there was some sectarian edge there. And basically everybody thought a little bit that they had the best scene going. And then we got into these troubles, and all the troubles were the same. And so I think for the first time it helped us to experience ourselves as Western or American Buddhists and facing these really big common problems, like how are we going to maintain the teachings of the Buddha in this country?
I remember in my first intensive meditation retreat, when I went to India and began practicing, I had some very kind of fanciful ideas about the miraculous technique I would be given, something very extraordinary and special and strange and esoteric. And I got there, and my instructor, my first teacher, said to me, well, sit down and feel your breath. And I thought, well, that's absurd. You know, I could have stayed home in the United States. Why did I come all the way to India to feel my breath? You may, for example, meet a teacher who really inspires you and moves you very much. And they're a very stern and commanding kind of person. And then the next day you might meet another teacher that really inspires you and moves you very much, but they're very gentle and soft. And one day you think, oh, I'll follow that person, and the next day you think, oh, I'll follow that person. And so it's very confusing because the inspiration is based on someone else. It's not based on your own experience. But as you move on, and get grounded in your own experience, then what is known as bright faith transforms into verified faith, because you verified the truth of things for yourself. And so it's a completely different, it just looks completely different.
I went to South Korea and I entered a Zen monastery there with a teacher called Kuzan Sunim, and I stayed there for 3 years, 3.5 years, just doing a very simple practice, a 3-month retreat every summer and every winter, and a slightly looser schedule during the spring and the autumn, sitting in a room, a room without windows, just rice paper, cushion on the floor with about 8 or 9 other people, and just asking the question, what is this? What is this? That's all we did. And we just focused on that single question. And this to me was precisely what I was looking for in a way. This practice, I felt, turned away from looking for metaphysical or doctrinal answers to such existential questions and returned to the very source of that primary existential inquiry that I feel was what motivated the Buddha himself to enlightenment in the first place. And after 4 years of doing that, my teacher died, and I felt the need really to return to the West, to no longer stay in remote Asian monasteries, and to begin to explore ways of interpreting and communicating what I had learned.
Getting up in the morning and walking to Birkenau. And Birkenau is next door to Auschwitz, and it's where the railroad tracks, the famous railroad tracks are, where the selection site. We go right to the selection site and sit in a very large circle. You imagine a circle of 100 people sitting around the selection. And then we, generally speaking, 1 or 2 people will begin to chant the names of people who have died there. The rest of us are sitting in meditation. The practice that most of us are doing is the practice of experiencing the emotions that arise when you're hearing these names and you're in this place with this physical symbol of hatred and anger and difference. Of course, we're not in any way emulating the experience of people who actually live there, but we are in that place for a week during a lot of silence. It's very powerful, and I'm really inadequate to explain it because none of us can really explain what happens, but I was profoundly changed by going to that. I went 3 years in a row, and it made a big difference in my ability to open even more to those things which I want to reject.
Our overarching mission is to create a more just, sustainable, compassionate, reflective society. I run the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. It's an organization that was started by 2 foundations, the Nathan Cummings Foundation in New York and Fetzer Institute in Michigan. And those foundations had worked together before on bringing awareness around mind-body integration into American culture. When they were exploring the body-mind connection and how that could be really helpful in health and healing and psychotherapy and so on, they discovered that many of the people who were working in that field or with that interconnection were also integrating contemplative practices into their work and had practices themselves, and a number of them had Buddhist practice. And so they thought that the next step toward could say a social awakening in America would be to look at ways in which meditation practice could have a beneficial effect in mainstream culture.
The Buddha put forth meditation as a kind of mind medicine, as a kind of treatment for a mind that is causing its own suffering. So meditation is a way of practicing being with your experience in a totally accepting way. So I think it's not so hard to understand how meditation is therapy. How could therapy be meditation? Yeah. What meditation is a close examination of what is it that's keeping you from being in the moment? What is it that's keeping you from being in the now? Okay, usually it's your reactions, it's your likes and dislikes, it's your holding on to the pleasant, pushing away the unpleasant. So therapy is a way of closely examining, just like meditation is, closely examining what is it that's keeping a person from being in this moment, in this relationship, from being with what is going on right now. And so in that way, therapy becomes meditation.
There are ways in which practices can be very helpful in mainstream settings without sacrificing the integrity of the practice. It's a big challenge, and you really need to work with teachers who are well grounded in the practice so that they don't too easily get, as we would say, co-opted by whatever the institution is, whether it's Yale Law School or Monsanto or whatever. We've also been working in we've given fellowships to 93 professors in colleges and universities around just this country to integrate contemplative practices into their teaching. And so, for example, people will have they'll have meditation in the classroom, and then they'll read nature poetry. That would be the kind of most obvious. And then they'd look at the ways in which there is a contemplative dimension to the poetry that might not otherwise have been seen if a person hadn't been investigating their own mind. But we also have fellows in astrophysics and architecture and in law schools and business schools and doing really extraordinary things.
When we started Tricycle, the idea was to disseminate Buddhist teachings. Not a very sophisticated or fancy idea, but it seemed like a very big job at the time, and it was. But now, it's only 10 years later. It's not a very long time. And everybody's disseminating Buddhist teachings. We've seen the growth of Buddhism has just happened so much faster than anything we could possibly imagine. You go to a bookstore, there must be a dozen new books a month with a Buddhist title, by a Buddhist teacher, by a Buddhist practitioner. So then the question becomes, what is our role? What are we doing? If your mission is being taken care of, fine, you do something else. The question is, do we have a role to play, and what is it? And it may be that as there is such a proliferation of Buddhism and of information, that we have to take a role of being the reliable navigator. And that, of course, is a much more political role than anything we have ever even thought to do. And that's something that we're looking at now. That's what's right in front of us to do.
The awareness practice that we teach is very much in that spirit that Buddhism isn't really meant to be an academic study or religion even. It's a way of life that anybody can adopt and would be happier for it. Then the loving kindness practice is based also on Buddhist teaching, with the idea that if we cultivate a capacity that we actually all have within us anyway, to be caring, to be connected, to have a spirit of friendship, first toward ourselves and ultimately toward all that lives, that we will, in a way, fulfill our human possibility.
mean, there's a lot of people in the world who understand the nature of form and emptiness. You can read world literature, you can read Shakespeare, you can read world poetry, and you can see aspects of form and emptiness. And you don't have to be a Buddhist to get it.
What, in fact, is the consequence of emptiness? Does it reveal to us a kind of transcendental reality of one mind or something that then bursts forth from its hidden depths? Or are we simply opened to the sheer contingency of the causes, conditions, effects, language, and so forth and so on that are allowed their fuller play? I would incline more to the latter, that emptiness allows us to experience the often terrifying, turbulent nature of the contingency of our existence, the contingency of the world.
In Koan study, what we're doing is we're becoming one with everything in the universe. So our experience of the Dharmakaya, our experience of emptiness, is done through a story. But here we're doing, our experience of emptiness, of oneness, is being done through going to a place where so much suffering has taken place. So we're using that as the vehicle to experience the oneness.
To take the principles of the practice and bring them into experience is always a challenge. You know, there's a lot that we do in practice that has to do with attention, having a fullness of attention, really being present and awake and aware with our experience. And so then one has to think, what does that mean when you're talking to another person? You know, it's not simply a question of not telling a lie, but what does it mean to have that same fullness and completeness of attention and awareness and wholeheartedness of presence when you're relating to somebody, and in every instance, every kind of situation, to try to bring forth those same principles.
Amazing stories have come back to us from the contemplative fellows who've taught. They report a real change in the relationship between teacher and student. That's the biggest thing. And a change in a way that they almost didn't realize was missing. But when it started again, it brings problems with it. It's more time consuming. When the relationship with the student changes and the student begins to open up and connect what he's studying with you with all kinds of other things and starts having deeper underlying questions about these things, the professors tend to want to spend more time with their students, and then they don't have time for this other thing they were doing over here. But that we've heard that over and over again. I mean, strategically, in the academic program, for example, many more professors now are wanting to do this kind of thing. And so eventually I think that it's going to become a respected new way of knowing.
And one of my favorite things about meditation practice is that I feel like the big lessons come in small packages. So that, for example, when I was first meditating and I was given that instruction to sit down and feel my breath, I found that it was nearly impossible to be with just one breath, because as soon as this breath was happening, I would, in effect, lean forward to feel the next one. I think, oh, what's the next one going to be like? Or I better be ready for it, or I better tense up a little bit in case I miss the next one. And just to feel one breath, to settle back and feel one breath was very, very difficult. And that was just a little model of what I did in my life anyway. You know, it was so hard to just be in the moment, but I was always trying to get ready for the next and worried that I'd miss it and so on. It was a very big life lesson, but it just came in that little package of, you know, oh, just feel this one breath.
I don't actually see my Buddhist practice as one thing and my work as a writer as another. For me, writing is my practice. At the moment also I'm working a lot with photography, and photography has become very much my practice. I don't make a separation between what I do in a self-conscious Buddhist way when I'm sitting on a cushion, for example, and what I do when I'm in the world. Being interviewed, for example, or counseling someone, or having to relate to my mother. This is my practice at that time. Everyday life needs to become a form of practice, rather than something into which we introduce Buddhist values and ideas and methodologies.
In Buddhist journalism, you could create a journalism that tried to take not only the I out of it. Of course, we know that you can't have that kind of objectivity. The teachings tell us that. But that you could write about certain things without judgment. I don't know to what extent we've been successful in doing that. I also know that the times that we've tried it, that I think some of what I would consider some of the more successful attempts to explore a situation without judgment. I think that members of the Buddhist community sometimes get very upset because they want the answers as much as the non-Buddhists. They want something that tells them this is right, this is wrong. They don't really want to live with the ambiguity of no right, no wrong any more than anybody else does. Maybe some evolved practitioners, but for most of our audience, they have as much resistance to that, I think, than as the society is large.
Helpless, helpless, helpless.
I think it was really only through my meditation practice and then my experiences in psychotherapy that I could come close enough to myself. It's a very common problem that the difficult feelings, the anger, the sadness, the fear that was too intense to fully experience when you were younger, that unless you find a way to process those feelings, that you can't really go forward in life.